mean I'll see it.
You know those parts of the Sierras where the trees just give up and everything turns to stone? That high-altitude granite that looks like the bleached bones of the world? That is where we were. It was supposed to be a standard trek, nothing technical, just a long haul through the boulder fields. There were 4 of us, but Elias was the one who lived for this stuff. He was the kind of guy who hiked with a pack that felt like a lead weight to anyone else, but he moved through the terrain like he was part of the geography itself. We were navigating this massive stretch of gray rock, these huge slabs that have been baking in the sun for thousands of years. Elias was maybe 50 feet ahead of us, just rounding a corner where a shoulder of granite jutted out like a jagged tooth. 1 second he was there, his hiking poles clicking against the stone, and the next second he was just gone. There wasn't a sound. No shout, no scrape of a boot slipping, no clatter of gear hitting the ground. When we rounded that same corner 10 seconds later, the trail was empty. It was just an expanse of gray under a sky that looked too blue to be real. We called his name until our throats felt raw and scraped, but the silence up there is different. It doesn't echo. It just swallows everything. We searched that immediate area for hours, looking for a crevice or a drop-off he might have tumbled into, but there was nothing. Just solid, unforgiving stone. By the time the search and rescue teams arrived with the bloodhounds, the air had turned cold and thin. That was the first time I felt that true, deep-seated wrongness. The handlers brought the dogs to the exact spot where Elias was last seen. These were professional tracking animals, dogs that had found bodies under 6 feet of snow and miles of brush. But when they reached the edge of that granite field, they stopped dead. They didn't bark. They didn't howl. They just sat down and started whimpering, a sound so pathetic and desperate it made the hair on my neck stand up. One of the dogs started clawing at its own snout until it bled, trying to turn back, its tail tucked so tight against its belly it looked deformed. The handlers couldn't get them to move an inch further into the rocks. It was like they were looking at a wall that we couldn't see. For 2 days, we stayed at the base camp while the helicopters circled. The mood was dense, a thick layer of dread that made it hard to breathe. People don't just evaporate. On the 3rd morning, a radio call came in from a team on the other side of the ridge, the northern face. It's a vertical drop, a sheer wall of granite that requires technical gear and years of experience to even attempt. They found him 5 miles away from the last point of contact. When they brought him down, I barely recognized him. He was alive, but he was catatonic. He was missing his boots and his socks. His feet. I can't forget the sight of them. The skin on his soles had been worn away entirely, leaving raw, red meat and white flashes of bone peeking through. It wasn't just from walking. It looked like his feet had been systematically flayed, the flesh shredded as if he'd been dragged through a blender made of sand. There were shards of translucent material embedded in his heels, deep in the muscle, things that looked like jagged splinters of window pane. The most unsettling part wasn't the blood or the injuries. It was the way he looked. Elias was a rugged guy, but he looked like he had been emptied out. His eyes were wide, fixed on a point somewhere behind the sky, and he didn't blink for minutes at a time. The rescuers said they found him sitting perfectly still on a ledge that shouldn't have been reachable from above or below. He was just sitting there in the middle of a vertical cliff, staring into the sun. I sat with him in the hospital 3 days later. The room was quiet, filled with that sterile, chemical scent that sticks to the back of your throat. He hadn't said a word to the doctors or the police. I reached out and touched his hand, and his skin felt like cold marble. It didn't feel like living tissue anymore. It felt dense and artificial. Finally, he turned his head. It was a slow, mechanical movement that made the vertebrae in his neck pop with a sound like dry twigs snapping. He looked at me, and his pupils were so dilated his eyes looked like 2 holes burned into a mask. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of sandpaper on stone. He didn't ask where he was. He didn't ask about the hike. He just leaned in and whispered, the air turned into glass. I asked him what he meant, but he just gripped my arm. His fingernails dug into my skin, and I realized he was missing the nails on his right hand. They hadn't been torn off. It looked like they had been ground down into the quick. He told me that as he rounded that corner, the world didn't change, but the atmosphere did. He said the oxygen became solid. He described it like walking into a pressurized chamber of invisible, jagged mirrors. He said every breath he took felt like inhaling crushed light bulbs. He told me he could see us. He could see us standing just a few feet away, screaming his name, but we were behind a layer of something that wasn't quite physical. He said he was screaming back, pounding his fists against the very air in front of him, but his hands were just shattering against the transparency. He showed me his palms. They were a lattice of fine, white scars, hundreds of them, crisscrossing in geometric patterns that no natural injury could ever produce. He spent those 48 hours trying to climb out of a space that had no dimensions. He told me that the ridge he was found on wasn't a mountain to him. It was just the only place where the glass was thin enough to crawl through. He spoke about the things he saw on the other side, things that weren't animals or people, but shapes that moved through the glass like shadows in deep water. He said they were curious. He said they liked the way he bled, because his blood was the only thing in that place that had a color. The smell in the room changed then. It wasn't the hospital anymore. It was a sharp, ozone-like stench mixed with the sickeningly sweet aroma of rotting fruit and the raw, iron-sweet tang of an open wound. I looked down at his feet, wrapped in thick gauze, and I saw a dark, brownish-red stain beginning to bloom through the white fabric. It wasn't moving like a liquid. It was spreading in sharp, crystalline fractals, growing like frost on a window pane. Elias hasn't been the same since that day. He doesn't sleep. He spends all his time in a darkened room because he says the light cuts him. If you stand near him, you can hear this faint, high-pitched ringing, a vibration that seems to come from his very bones. The doctors say it's some kind of neurological trauma, but I saw what they pulled out of his feet. It wasn't granite. It wasn't quartz. When the lab tried to analyze those shards, the material didn't show up on any periodic table. It was perfectly clear, harder than diamond, and it evaporated into a foul-smelling gas the moment they tried to put a drill to it. Sometimes I think about that Granite Field. I think about how many people go missing in the parks every year, people who just vanish between one step and the next. I think about the dogs whimpering at the edge of nothing. Elias told me one last thing before I left that day, something that haunts me every time I look at a clear blue sky. He said, "It's still there. The glass didn't break. It just closed behind me." Now, whenever I'm outside and the wind dies down and the world gets that perfect, terrifyingly clear stillness, I find myself reaching out my hand, terrified that I'm going to feel a cold, hard surface where the air should be. I'm scared that one day, I'll turn a corner and the atmosphere will solidify, locking me into a transparent cage while my friends walk by, inches away, never knowing I'm screaming against the sky. The worst part is seeing Elias now. He sits by the window and watches the birds. He doesn't look at them with longing. He looks at them with pity. He told me the birds are the only ones who know how to navigate the seams. And sometimes, when he thinks I'm not looking, I see him scratching at the air in front of his face, his fingers searching for a crack, his eyes full of a hollow, lingering terror that tells me he never really came all the way back. He's still half submerged in that frozen, invisible hell, waiting for the rest of us to join him.
Next story.
I've spent most of my life in the deep timber, so I'm used to the way the woods can feel like they're watching you. It's a natural thing, usually just a mountain lion or a curious black bear keeping its distance. But there's a specific kind of quiet that tells you something is fundamentally wrong with the world. I was out in a stretch of the national forest that most people don't bother with because the terrain is brutal, thick brush, steep ridges, and no marked trails for miles. I had my bow with me, tracking a buck I'd seen on my trail cam a week earlier. The air was cool, the sun was just starting to dip behind the peaks, and everything seemed normal until it wasn't. The transition happened in an instant. 1 second, I could hear the squirrels barking and the wind rustling the dry oak leaves, and the next, it was like someone had hit a kill switch on the entire forest. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. It felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the clearing, replaced by a dense, stagnant pressure that made it hard to swallow. I stopped moving, my boots frozen on a bed of pine needles. I didn't even want to breathe because the sound of my own lungs felt like a siren in that void. I pulled my binoculars from my chest harness, moving as slowly as humanly possible. I scanned the edge of a clearing about 80 yards away, looking for any sign of movement. At first, I thought my eyes were failing me. I adjusted the focus, thinking maybe the lenses had fogged up from my breath. But the image didn't clear. In the center of the frame, standing right next to a massive cedar tree, was a patch of the woods that didn't make sense. It looked like heat rising off a highway in July, a shimmering, liquid distortion that warped the bark of the tree behind it. As I watched, the distortion moved. It had a liquid grace that I can't compare to any animal I've ever seen. It was tall, thin, and humanoid, but it didn't have a solid surface. It was like a man-shaped piece of stained glass that was constantly melting and reforming. As it stepped into the light, it didn't cast a shadow. It just blurred the world around it, turning the green needles and brown bark into a chaotic, swirling mess of colors. My stomach turned immediately. A wave of intense, primal nausea hit me so hard I thought I was going to vomit right there. It wasn't just fear, it was a biological rejection of what I was looking at. Every instinct in my DNA was screaming that this thing shouldn't exist. I lowered the binoculars, my heart hammering against my ribs with a leaden, rhythmic thud. I looked back at the spot with my naked eyes, and it was even harder to track. If I looked directly at it, I could barely see it. But if I looked just to the side, I could see the way the trees behind it would bend and snap out of place as it glided forward. It was heading toward a small depression in the ground, a little gully filled with overgrown ferns and rotting logs. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the scent of an animal. It was the salt iron stench of an open wound, mixed with something sweet and rotting, like a carcass that had been left to bloat in a damp basement. It was the smell of a butcher shop floor at the end of a long, hot shift. It was thick in the back of my throat, making me gag. I stayed crouched behind a fallen log, watching that shimmering shape descend into the gully. There was something already down there. I saw a flash of bright blue, synthetic fabric. A backpack. I leaned forward, my curiosity briefly overriding my terror. As the shimmer hovered over the blue shape, it seemed to solidify slightly. The distortion became more pronounced, and I heard a wet, tearing sound, not a sharp noise, but a slow, rhythmic ripping, like someone pulling wet leather apart. I didn't see blood at first. I saw a spray of dark, viscous fluid hit the ferns, looking almost black in the fading light. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop. I raised the binoculars again, and my breath hitched. There was a man lying in the ferns. He wasn't moving. He looked like he'd been dropped from a great height, his limbs bent at angles that made my own joints ache just looking at them. The shimmering entity was crouched over him. It didn't have hands, not really. It had long, tapering points of light that moved like needles. I watched as those points began to systematically peel the clothing and the skin away from the man's torso. There was no struggle. The man was already gone, his eyes wide and clouded, staring up at the canopy with a look of pure, frozen shock. The gore was clinical. It wasn't a frenzied feeding. It was a harvest. The entity was pulling things out of him, organs, bits of bone, long strings of sinew, and they seemed to vanish into the distortion of its body. As it consumed him, the shimmer became more vibrant, more real. The iron salt smell grew so potent I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. The sight of that man's ribcage being picked clean by an invisible, humming force is something that is burned into the back of my eyelids. I can still see the way the moonlight caught the wet surface of his exposed muscle. I knew I had to leave. If that thing finished its meal and turned its attention to the ridge, I wouldn't stand a chance. I began to back away, keeping my eyes locked on the gully. I didn't turn around. I moved one agonizing inch at a time, feeling the oppressive weight of the silence pressing down on me. Every time a twig snapped under my boot, I felt a jolt of electricity run up my spine. The nausea hadn't faded, it had settled into a cold, hollow ache in the pit of my stomach. I backed up for what felt like miles before I finally reached the old logging road that led back to the trailhead. I didn't run until I could see the silhouette of my truck. I threw my gear into the bed, not even bothering to case my bow, and tore out of there so fast I nearly fishtailed into a ditch. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station at the edge of the park. There were 3 SUVs parked out front with their lights spinning, local sheriff's deputies, and a search and rescue team. A woman was sitting on the steps, her head in her hands, sobbing with a sound that was jagged and broken. I walked up to one of the deputies, my voice cracking as I tried to speak. He told me they were looking for a hiker, a guy who had gone missing earlier that afternoon. He'd wandered off from his group about 3 miles from where I'd been hunting. I started to tell him what I saw, but the words died in my throat. How do you tell a cop that a man-shaped ripple in the air is currently deconstructing a human being in a gully 3 miles out? I just told him I'd been in the area and hadn't seen anyone. I felt like a coward, but looking at the sheriff's face, I realized he wouldn't believe me anyway. He'd think I was high or experiencing some kind of high-altitude psychosis. They never found that hiker. Not a scrap of his blue backpack, not a single bone, not even a drop of blood for the cadaver dogs to find. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist. The search went on for 2 weeks before they called it off, citing the treacherous terrain and the possibility of a mountain lion attack. But I know what happened. I know that thing is still out there, blending into the pines, waiting for the woods to go quiet again. I sold my bow a month later. I haven't been back to the national forest since, and I don't think I ever will. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in my living room and the house gets too quiet, I'll catch a glimpse of a distortion in the corner of a slight shimmer in the air near the hallway. I tell myself it's just a trick of the light, or a floater in my vision. But then I smell it. That faint, unmistakable scent of salt and iron, like a rusted pipe leaking onto a warm floor, and I realize that whatever is out there doesn't just stay in the woods. It follows the scent of the people who saw it.
Next story.
There is a specific kind of quiet you only find in the deep parts of a southern swamp, where the humidity is so thick you can practically feel it filling up your lungs like wet wool. We were 4 days into a search for this guy, a nature photographer who'd gone off trail to find some rare orchid or something. He vanished near the Black Creek Basin, a place where the water doesn't really flow. It just sits there, black and stagnant, reflecting the cypress knees like jagged teeth. We were running a standard grid line, about 20 feet between each of us. It was grueling work, hacking through sawgrass and trying not to trip over submerged roots that could snap an ankle in a second. I had Miller on my left. He was a solid guy, a former high school linebacker who'd been with the SAR team for 6 years. We'd seen everything together, missing hikers, drowned kids, the works. He wasn't the type to get spooked by the shadows. The sun was starting to dip, casting these long, sickly orange streaks across the water. I remember the air felt still, almost pressurized, like the atmosphere was holding its breath. Miller called out that his lace had snagged on a root and he needed a second to fix his boot. I saw him kneel down, his orange vest the only bright thing in that gray-green hell. I nodded and looked down at my compass to verify our bearing, just a 5-second check to make sure the line wasn't drifting into the deeper muck. When I looked back up, the spot where Miller had been kneeling was empty. I didn't panic immediately. I figured he'd just stepped behind a cypress to take a leak or something, but the silence that followed was wrong. It wasn't just the absence of his voice, it was like the entire swamp had gone deaf. I yelled his name, a sharp, ragged sound that seemed to hit a wall and drop straight into the water. No answer. I whistled, the long, piercing signal we used to locate each other in the brush. Nothing. I moved toward where I'd last seen him. The ground there was a slurry of peat and rotted leaves. I found his radio first. It was sitting on top of an old, moss-covered stump, perfectly centered. It hadn't been dropped or lost in a struggle. It had been placed there, and the dial had been clicked firmly to the off position. The search for the photographer stopped right then. For the next 72 hours, the entire county was out there looking for one of our own. We brought in the K9 units, but the dogs were useless. They'd get within 50 yards of that stump and just stop. They wouldn't bark, wouldn't howl, they just sat down and stared up into the canopy with their ears pinned back, shivering so hard you could hear their teeth clicking. I didn't sleep. None of us did. We spent 3 days wading through that waist-deep slurry, our skin getting pruned and raw from the stagnant water. The smell out there started to change. It wasn't just the usual swamp gas and decaying vegetation anymore. It was something sharper, a cloying, iron-sweet tang that reminded me of a butcher shop floor at the end of a long shift. It was the smell of something open and wet. On the third afternoon, we were pushing through a dense thicket of tupelo trees about a half-mile from where he'd vanished. One of the guys, a kid named Davis, looked up and just started screaming. It wasn't a help me scream, it was a high, thin sound, like a tea kettle. Miller was there. He was 30 feet up, wedged into a fork of a massive cypress tree. His body was twisted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible, his legs dangling uselessly while his torso was jammed tight between two thick branches. We had to get a climbing team in there just to reach him. When they finally lowered him down, I almost wished they hadn't. He was alive, but he looked like he'd been through a meat grinder. His fingernails were gone, replaced by raw, oozing pits where he'd clearly been clawing at the bark for days. His face was a map of deep, jagged lacerations, and the skin around his mouth was split and bruised, as if something had been clamped over it with tremendous force. But it was his eyes that got me. They were wide, the pupils blown out so large there was almost no color left, staring at nothing. He didn't speak for a long time. We got him back to the trauma center, pumped him full of fluids, and treated the infection starting to rot his feet. It wasn't until the second night in the ICU that he finally looked at me. His voice was a dry, papery rasp, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. He told me that the moment I turned my head to check the compass, the air behind him had simply curdled. He didn't hear a footstep. He didn't feel a presence. He just felt a massive, cold pressure, a hand that felt like a slab of frozen meat, clamp over his mouth and nose. It wasn't just big, he said it felt like the fingers wrapped all the way around the back of his skull. He tried to scream, tried to reach for his radio, but he said his muscles just stopped working, like he'd been struck by lightning, but the current never left his body. He felt himself being lifted. Not pulled, not dragged, lifted straight up into the air. He said he watched me from above. He watched me look for him. He watched me pick up his radio. He said he was less than 20 feet above my head the whole time I was calling his name. Every time he tried to make a sound, the pressure on his face would tighten until he heard his jaw creak. And then there was the voice. He said it wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, but a vibration that pulsed through his teeth and into his brain. It didn't sound human. It sounded like the grinding of stones or the slow breaking of old wood. The voice kept telling him the same thing over and over for 3 days straight. Just keep watching. It forced him to watch us search. It forced him to watch the sun go down and the predators come out in the dark. He said the worst part wasn't the pain or the thirst. It was the feeling of whatever was holding him there. He described it as something ancient and incredibly patient, something that wasn't eating him because it found his terror more nourishing than his flesh. Miller was never the same after that. He moved out of the state a month later. He doesn't go outside after dark, and I heard from his sister that he has to sleep with all the lights on because if he sees a shadow in the corner of the room, he starts to choke, as if that hand is coming back for him. I still work the SAR calls, but I don't go into the Black Creek Basin anymore. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods and the wind dies down just right, I get that feeling of the air becoming dense and pressurized. I don't check my compass. I don't look down. I just keep my eyes up, searching the branches, terrified that I'm going to see a pair of wide, staring eyes looking back down at me, waiting for the moment I turn my back. Because the photographer, the guy we were originally looking for, we never found him. Not a scrap of clothing, not a piece of camera gear. Nothing. And honestly, after seeing what happened to Miller, I think that photographer might have been the lucky one. At least he didn't have to watch.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.